Um, yeah, no, I mean, so look, glad to have you back in New York City. Welcome to the show. I know you've been traveling around to Europe. You just came back from DC. You're promoting a book that is set to be coming out in February. And it's basically on how elite universities are benefiting themselves at the expense of taxpayers, at the expense of students, at the expense of faculty. But you yourself went to Georgetown and are now at Columbia Law School. So on the surface, that seems a little
Yeah,
hypocritical. So can you just explain that to start?
sure. Yeah, look, I think that's a totally fair question. I think it's a really important question. How can I be criticizing these schools when I'm benefiting from them when I've attended two of the more prestigious schools in America? My view on this is a little bit different. I think it's more important to criticize the institutions you are a part of, because otherwise you sort of get this, sort of ideological bubble that forms within the schools and outside them too, right? Where the critiques that come from outside are sort of seen as, oh, they're salty, they didn't get in, they don't get it, or they're culturally opposed to the schools, whereas the conformity within is sort of this like reassuring feeling that everything we're doing is good. And so for me, I think the schools are actually amazing. I think they open up all sorts of really incredible doors for all sorts of people. My issue with the elite schools is that they're way too expensive and far too many people are allowed in. And so my critique is much more narrow. It's not that we should abolish the elite schools, it's that we should expand and make them more affordable.
Interesting that you say that far too many are allowed in. I feel like ra acceptance rates are pretty low.
No, I said far too few.
Oh, sorry, missed
Yeah, yeah.
that. But
Maybe I
yeah,
misspoke. Let me correct the record. Far too few people are let in through the
got it.
doors.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. So it's much more restrictive, and
right.
it's interesting because then that also helps drive up price. And I'm
Exactly.
coming from an old school mentality. Graduating 2008, where at that time there wasn't that this sort of economy that we're in. There isn't a creator economy. You didn't have to take on large amounts of debt at the age of 18 when your brain even hasn't fully formed to make these decisions. But at that time in life and in the period of time in 2008, it's like you needed that piece of paper to actually get a job. And so things have
Yep.
changed now. And so I can see why people go to school, but I think that there's this change that we're seeing, especially in the sense that, at the time of this recording, it's been a week since Rick Singer was sentenced. And Rick Singer, he's the mastermind of the Varsity Blues Scandal. We hear a lot of university scandals. This is a famous one. Most people might be aware of it. It's the one where Lori Loughlin from Full House was accused of, helping her daughter get in, and, a bunch of other celebrities. And so my question to you is, um, Rick Singer gets 3.5 years. He gets 3 years of supervised, probation afterwards, and he's set to pay $19 million. To
Mhm.
you, is that a fair penalty for that
So
crime?
yeah, so what's really interesting about Rick Singer, and what I think that maybe the media has missed, is he flipped on all of those parents. So on face, it might seem like, oh, 3 years, like that's not such a big sentence, but virtually all of those parents also served some jail time. And the only reason they were able to do that is because Rick Singer turned FBI informant. And so there's this part of my book in the introduction, which I think is really interesting, which is a transcript of Rick Singer calling one of his former clients at the behest of the FBI. And, he's making small talk. And then he's trying to get them to confirm that they gave him money to get their daughter in. And the woman is like clearly feeling that it's sus, but she can't help but confirm it because she doesn't want to be rude to this guy who got her daughters in. And that's how both of those parents ended up getting convicted. And so, I agree with the premise of the question. Maybe 3 years is light, but in light of, all of the other convictions that it facilitated, I think, there's an argument to be made that maybe it's okay.
Yeah, because it's interesting. I think there's like people that'll say that that's a light sentence, and there are crimes that are less egregious that get longer sentences. And so you'll always have that kind of conversation. But if we're talking about scandals, we just talked about the Varsity Blues scandals, but there's a number of other ones. I mean, you can just Google this stuff, but two in particular that I did a little research on to prepare for this was one was with the Columbia rankings, and the
Right.
other is known as the price fixing cartel. And so
Yeah.
just to
Yeah.
recap, like the Columbia, they both happened in 2022, which I also find fascinating. But Columbia, they got caught gaming the ranking system. It was actually brought to the attention of the world by a whistleblower
Yep.
internally. Yeah, it was a
Yep.
math professor. And so that goes back to one of your earlier points around like, you should question the institution that you're in. And
Yep.
so, you can expand on it, but there's that.
Sure.
There's also, again in 2022, the New York Times
Mhm.
reported that there were 16 elite colleges that were part of a price fixing cartel. So
Mhm.
can you tell us more about both of those
So,
scandals?
so I'm actually very connected with both of those stories. I mean, both of those formed up a big part of this book when I was in the research process. Those were two of the great scandals before they even became public that I was really looking into. And so let's start with the Columbia ranking scandal because I think it sort of ties in with what you were saying about Rick Singer. So what happened in the Columbia ranking scandal is the administrators within the school realized that the U.S. News and World Report wasn't really paying such close attention to some aspects of that data. Um, for those who don't know, the U.S. News and World Report has like majority market share in the college rankings market. Essentially, like it is the de facto regulator of elite colleges, and actually at this point, almost all colleges. So, in order to show progress to your board of trustees, in order to show progress if you're a public school to your governors and your state legislators, basically everyone is benchmarked up against the U.S. News and World Report. Now, the U.S. News and World Report is really interesting because, what they do is they send a survey out to all of these schools. They ask the schools to self-report a lot of data and then also to comment on other schools. Um, a lot of times, the data is very easily verifiable. So, for example, the number of students that are enrolled, very easily verifiable. There are other places to go and check that stuff. The price you're charging, very easily verifiable. A lot of other places to go and check that stuff. Schools have to report revenue in their tax filings and all these other places. Things that are less easily verifiable, things like how much is actually being spent on teaching students. So in the Columbia case, they were counting over $1 billion, I believe, of hospital spending on patients that had nothing to do with students whatsoever. I mean, Columbia also has a hospital, right? A lot of universities also have a university affiliated hospital. And they were counting that as student expenditure in order to game the ranking. Um, Doing other things. They were saying that close to like 100% of their faculty had terminal degrees, so like PhDs or higher. Also, like verifiably alive. And so this math professor, this tenured math professor at Columbia, was the one who started looking into all of these things. And he's like, "Wait, the numbers don't add up." And he published this fantastic report, this whistleblower's report, and he put it up. And so when I first came to Columbia, I went and sat down with him, and I spoke to him about like what inspired you to do all this stuff, like why was this so important for you to do. And what he said to me basically is he wanted Columbia to move away from this rankings mania, where they don't care about the rankings, and they certainly shouldn't care. His argument was they certainly shouldn't care so much that they'd be willing to fudge the numbers. Um, what's happened since is the school has had to admit that they were supplying false information to the rankings. But it's not just Columbia. Other schools have gotten in trouble. Temple University recently got in trouble. USC's business school, I believe, or some sort of graduate school recently got in trouble. I think there was also a scandal at Claremont McKenna. And those are the ones that have been found out. There has yet to be a systemic, like audit of a lot of the data that's been submitted going back years. I'm sure like US News and World Report has done it internally, but it's certainly not something that's public. And so who knows how far the rot goes.
Right.
In this rat race, if you can get an edge by lying, and when the pressure is so intense on these schools to do that, because that's where their market power comes from, is how highly they're ranked. That's why students want to come. They have been lying. I mean, it's just an empirical fact that they've been lying. And so I think people like Michael Thaddeus are very important for this system because, but for him, I mean, this story could have gone another 10 years, another 20 years, as it's already gone, nearly a decade that this type of lying has been happening at Columbia. So, I really applaud what he's done. I think it's really important. But I think the broader question that we ought to be asking about that is also really important, right? Is why does Columbia care so much about the rankings? And not just Columbia, why does everyone care so much about the rankings? Why are we so prestige obsessed? And my argument is in the book that actually prestige is virtually the entire differentiator in product. In terms of education, a lot of courses are basically available online. You have MIT Open Courseware, you have Yale courses basically published in their entirety on YouTube. You have a lot of stuff that's available online. And so if you think back to like even American history, someone like Abraham Lincoln, he studied the law by borrowing his neighbor's textbooks and just reading at night. Now imagine what someone like him could do with YouTube, with Google, with all of the tools that are available today. And yet, for whatever reason, we've done everything possible to make it less likely that someone like Abraham Lincoln could self-study and become a great lawyer. Today, in order to become a lawyer, you first have to get an undergraduate degree, then you have to go to law school, then you have to, achieve all the right credentials, and then you can enter the legal profession after 7 years of school. And so I think there is something that's really broken about our education system, where what we're doing is allocating prestige, and very little about it is actually about the skills. It makes sense from an employer's point of view. If I'm an employer, there are all these applicants. How do I know who's good, right? A shortcut for me is to see, oh, this guy went to Harvard, this guy went to U Chicago. It's a very easy cognitive shortcut. And so that's where virtually all the value of the elite schools comes from, is the signaling aspect. Now, here's where I think, signaling is not always a bad thing. So if you think about someone like President Obama, I think you would be hard pressed to make the argument that if he hadn't gone to Harvard Law, that he could have been president of the United States. And I'm not saying that as a positive thing. I think that's like a very sad truth about our society, that people would have judged him differently if he went to Howard instead of Harvard. But I think it is true that that prestige almost served as a counterweight to systemic bias against him for his race, right? And if you look at the empirical literature, the people who benefit most from elite degrees are people like President Obama, first generation college students, or underrepresented minorities, women, people from Appalachia, someone like a JD Vance who went to Yale Law and is now a senator. These are the people who disproportionately benefit from the signaling. The people who don't benefit are people like George W. Bush, someone whose father was vice president and then president, someone who went to Andover, Yale, and then got a Harvard MBA. But I mean, I don't think anyone really focused on George Bush's degrees, or if they did, it was to prove that he wasn't stupid, right? It wasn't like with someone like JD Vance, someone like Barack Obama, was a big part of the story about what kind of person they are, and help them overcome otherwise, what would have been stereotypes or negative perceptions about them. And so, the economic literature is really clear about this. There was this one study that was conducted where a person, if they got into Harvard or another very elite school, but then didn't go, they found that there was virtually no income difference in that type of person. So if you're good enough to get into the schools, but chose not to go, over time, things evened out, except for people who are underrepresented minorities, women, and first generation college students. And so I think signaling is important. It's not always bad, but we've flipped the formula. The elite schools today are basically about keeping all of those types of people out, filtering through all the rich kids like George W. Bush, people who aren't going to benefit from that signal anyway. And that's one of the things I'm critiquing.
Hmm. I find that interesting because in the context of legacy,
Mm-hmm.
I
Right.
mean, expand on that a little bit, because I would imagine that these elite universities do give the advantage to the George Bushes
Absolutely.
of the world.
Absolutely. So, I mean, the whole admissions process is structured in that way, right? So, legacy is a very obvious thing. There's something called development cases. So, we talked a little bit about Varsity Blues. When I was at Georgetown, there was a student whose parents bribed the tennis coach through Rick Singer, and got their daughter in. And when the Varsity Blues scandal happened and all of this came out, the sort of like feeling on campus wasn't like one of, oh, how could they do something like this? I think everyone understood that you can use money to get your kids in. The feeling on campus was almost one of embarrassment, as if her parents had been too cheap to pay the donation up front to the school, that they'd been trying to save money and cut corners to use this back door. And instead of paying 2 million, they only paid 200,000. And so, I mean, I think that tells you everything about the culture at a lot of these campuses, where it has become so exclusive. The use of money to sort of grease the wheel has become so obvious that it's almost not even a shock anymore. When you hear about things like development cases, where development cases are basically where, a parent or a close relative pays a massive amount of money in a donation, and then gets a boost for children or other people that are indicated. And so those types of things are baked in to the admissions process. And so, like I said, I mean, we've created the system where the people who would benefit from these types of like prestigious signals very rarely even get the chance to get in.
Yeah, I'm just curious, as you imagine what the future might look like, do you think there could be a way for people that start with a leg down in life to be able to signal their talent and competency, through an institution that's not gate kept to the extremely exclusive degree that the Ivy League universities is? Is there going to be a way that a higher number of people are able
Mhm.
to signal their talent, and it's not just whittled down to just a few that kind of get the launch pad into that more, I suppose, powerful or economically empowered sleeve of society?
Yeah, so I have two thoughts on that. The first is sort of a story from like World War II, which is during World War II, when they were first coming up with really sophisticated aircraft that made a lot of noise. What some researchers at Harvard realized was, in order to like really understand what pilots are saying at ground control, you needed to get them to narrow the range of possible words. And so they started using what now we call, I think, the NATO alphabet. So they would say alpha, tango, foxtrot, but they wouldn't. So the range of possible words were severely limited, because that way the receiver, could sort of like, match even with a lot of background noise, because they knew what they were trying to expect. And I think what that tells you is something very deep about human psychology, which is, in a lot of noise, unless there's some sort of standardized alphabet, unless there's some sort of standardized signal, we don't really know how to decipher information. And so what you're saying is really interesting, right? Like, can people signal outside of this system, right? I think some people can, but at scale, when you have a whole society trying to do that, it sort of breaks apart because it gets too noisy. How do you compare one person to another, right? It goes back to this like job application thing, right? You have all these resumes. Maybe one's a chess champion, maybe one's really good at ballet. Those tell you some important things about that person, but how do you compare them? So I think it works for some jobs. For the creator economy, I think it's something that can work. But for a lot of these more like institutionalized jobs, where you're in the knowledge economy, where you're basically trying to compare people, I think it doesn't really work. It does break down, and that's why I think colleges are still quite important, because for that sector of the economy, you're still going to have to get credentialed in this standardized way. And we have a standard, right? It's the US News and World Report creates that standardization by ranking by prestige. So now you can compare someone from Harvard with someone from Haverford. They're differentiated, but you basically know where, like, where the students who go to one or students who go to another, where they would rank relative to each other. It's not perfect, but it sort of works. It sort of helps employers cut through sort of that noise. And so it's a lot like the NATO alphabet. Um, Point about, okay, well, but why can't we, have more people than maybe move through that system as it exists? I agree with you. And so one of the things I talk about in my book is, the US News and World Report doesn't have to rank schools in the way that it does. I mean, a lot of what it's doing in ranking is actually very distortive. It's creating more noise. It's very inefficient. What they could be doing is, instead of like rewarding schools for being more exclusive, I think they ought to be rewarding schools who create better students, better graduates, more productive people. That's not what's happening. The way the US News and World Report works right now is if you spend more money on less students, you climb up. That's that's the basic formula. More money, less students. So as much as you can spend on as few people. I think we need to reverse that. I think if you spend less money on more students, but there's some other outcomes that you're also measuring, those are the schools that we ought to prioritize and list higher. I think the natural implication of that will be it will be in each school's incentive to produce more graduates. So this is a big part of my book, which is I use the somewhat provocative title, the College Cartel. What do I mean by that? The schools are sort of like OPEC. Each of the schools hasn't really been expanding the number of seats, right? And if you think about it, it doesn't make any sense. If you're in any other industry, in any other business, and you're sitting on an endowment of 40 billion, 50 billion, why wouldn't you open new campuses? Why wouldn't you try to increase market share? Why wouldn't you be going after your competitor's kid? They're not doing it. They're not competing. And the reason is because of the way the U.S. News and World Report regulates this market. If you do that, you fall in the ranking, so no one's going to do it. And I think it's like one of the most anti-competitive hub and spoke cartels, where you have like the brain, the U.S. News and World Report rankings, controlling all these schools from the center, and the schools benefit from it. They know that's where their money comes from because everyone now is incentivized to be exclusive. Now there's systemic scarcity. And so they have done absolutely nothing to get rid of US News and World Report. In fact, they've often defended it. When the Obama administration tried to, create a national rankings that was done by the government, the elite colleges lobbied against that vigorously, killed the proposal. And so, time after time, you can see how the schools have been protecting their own self-interest and protecting this cartel.
Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting because those rankings matter because they influence a person's behavior. And what's also interesting about the rankings, if I understand it correctly, most of it, I think close to 80% of it is just quantitative measures that are submitted by the school themselves. So
Right.
it's really kind of you're seeing a lot of false data. And just going back on the Columbia thing, I think they went from number 2 to number 18 after like it was re-ranked. And so that's a big difference.
So, so on the 18 point, what's really interesting is the U.S. News and World Report like basically just made up numbers to give them a new
Yeah.
ranking because Columbia said that they're pulling out. And so the U.S. News and World Report wanted to punish them because they made them look bad. And so they came up with a bunch of numbers and they ranked them 18. What's going to happen, I believe, is going forward, the school is going to start to clean its data and resubmit and then climb up again. And the trustees will be happy and the whole system will continue to perpetuate. It's sort of like a slap on the wrist in the grand scheme of things, in the way this sort of like conspiracy works, this cartel works. And I think it's something that doesn't get nearly enough attention.
Jay, earlier you raised a question around like how do you measure how do you measure who's going to be able to get in? Like how do you signal yourself through the noise? And maybe the colleges do that by figuring out who's going to be able to pay, right? So that if you're on a wait list with 30 other people, they're going to try to figure out who's going to be able to pay that tuition, and then that's how you get through into the school.
So, that's definitely a big part of it. I think it's like empirically proven that kids on the wait list, if they donate, much better chance of getting.
Yeah.
And in fact, that's a big part of the price fixing lawsuit that you brought up earlier. And happy to get into that if we want to move.
Yeah, we're into
direction.
scandals today. We're into scandals today.
Yeah.
Let's get involved in that one.
Okay, so this is actually really interesting because this is the other aspect of the cartel, and it's actually one I didn't expect when I started writing the book. So the book was initially going to be about the relationship between U.S. News and all the schools and how it's creating all this scarcity of seats, how it's creating systemic high prices, how it's creating all these bad incentives. And as I started researching this, I realized that in the 1990s, the Department of Justice sued MIT and the 8 Ivy League colleges for fixing prices. And what they had been doing since the 1960s is these schools, these 9 schools, would get together, every spring at what they called an overlap meeting. And they would go through their lists of admitted students. And so they'd say, Jay got admitted into Harvard. And then everyone else who admitted J would raise their hand. And then they would start colluding on how much financial aid all of them would agree to offer J, so that the net price was virtually the same. So they're doing this from 1960 all the way to, the early 1990s. The early 1990s, DOJ brings a lawsuit. The schools get scared. All 8 Ivy League schools settle. They say, we weren't fixing prices, but we won't do it again. And it was a really funny settlement. But MIT doesn't settle. MIT takes it to court. In court, they lose at the district court level. They appeal. At the appeals court level, the judge comes up with some sort of technicality about how you apply antitrust laws and what the standards should have been. And so it's remanded back to district court. Now, schools still haven't won. If the government wants to prosecute this, they could go back to district court and win again. What happens, though, is Bill Clinton gets elected in 1992. He starts putting pressure on the DOJ to settle the case. He's a big elite schools guy. A lot of his donor base, is affiliated with those very elite institutions. And so the DOJ essentially settles with the schools. At the same time, while MIT is fighting this in court, the other schools start leaning on their members of Congress, on their senators. They start greasing the wheel in the legislative branch because in case they lose in the judicial, they want to back up. And what happens is Congress ends up passing an antitrust exemption so that the schools can keep doing what they were doing and never get sued like this again. So regardless of what would have happened at the judicial level, the Congress basically says, we're changing the rules of the game. And so the elite schools have this exemption called the Section 568 exemption. What they then do is they create what they call the 568 President's Group. It's based on this very niche exemption that no one in the media talks about. I mean, it was completely uncovered story up until this lawsuit. And so for the better part of 20 years, and I went through all the major media outlets. This exemption got approved and reapproved every 7 years. It came up for renewal, kept getting renewed, no dissension, no one attacked it. Clear as day that they were continuing on with these price fixing practices. But the exemption had some strings attached. Unlike in the Ivy overlap days, schools were now no longer able to say, J got in, who else accepted J? Now let's come up with a price. Instead, what they were allowed to do is they're allowed to, before this type of meeting, they're allowed to go to a meeting and come up with a common formula on assessing someone's financial need, someone's financial circumstance. Everyone then used the same formula. Through the FAFSA forms, they got all the same data. They plugged all the same data into the exact same formula, and magically they came up with the same amount of net price for the student at all of these participating 568 schools. Basically the exact same thing, a level abstracted. They're using a formula. They're not doing a meeting anymore. So maybe it looks a little bit better, but the exact same thing in practice, essentially the exact same thing. The other string attached on the exemption was that schools had to agree to admit students on a need-blind basis. This is what they didn't do because we've been talking about it. Legacy, donations, development cases, getting in off the wait list. If you obviously donate to the school, all of those things are not need blind. You're clearly considering someone's financial circumstance if you're going to tip the scales in their direction if you do that. And so what this lawsuit is about is that the schools, the lawyers allege, the schools never actually qualified for that exemption. And so what they've been doing for the last 20 years, this thing that's never been discussed by the media, this thing that's never been criticized, which nonetheless has raised the net price of tuition for so many students because the schools haven't been competing on price. This, the lawyers say, was actually in violation of the original antitrust laws because the exemption they never qualified for because they weren't admitting students on a need-blind basis. So what's going to happen at trial is the jury, if it gets to that level, is going to decide whether or not schools were admitting students on a need-blind basis. The whole case essentially is going to revolve around that key question because both sides admit that they were a member of this conspiracy, that they colluded on a common formula, and that they used the formula to, what the schools would term ration aid, and what the lawyers would say fixed prices. And obviously, I agree with
Millions of dollars,
Yeah.
millions
you're
and
right.
millions of
Yeah.
dollars, like over
No,
time. Oh, there you
billions.
go. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
someone
Could
did a calculation. It's almost $4 billion that the schools extracted by fixing prices in this way.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, my natural question would be, when you price fix, you're essentially fixing the price above what the price demand would naturally arrive at. It stands to reason these schools are taking more value from kids than they're giving back. So, like, where are all those excess dollars and where's all that excess value going?
Yeah, it goes into the endowments. And then what happens is it gets invested in the money markets because they don't use the endowments to expand seats. They're not letting in more students. They're not building new campuses. So what they've been doing is they've been building these big, massive piggy banks, tax free, and they've been seeing how big they can grow it. And that's been the name of the game at the elite colleges virtually this entire time. The endowments keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger every single year. I mean, at this point, it's really approaching obscene, right? When Harvard has $50 billion, like just invested in random assets, in timber and in copper, in companies and in private equity. I mean, it has nothing to do with the institution. It doesn't actually help educate anyone. They spend 5% of that a year on what they call education, oftentimes on things completely unrelated from the students. And what they make in the money markets is much greater than that 5%. And so the endowment keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger every single year. And so there's no end in sight. What's really interesting, I think, Jay, about your question is, well, there are no shareholders. They can't, take dividends. Well, what's the logic behind keeping this growing? They take dividends in all these small ways, right? So the administrators, pay themselves heavier and heavier salaries. There's more and more administrative bloat. They take big vacations. They can do really interesting things. They can hobnob with politicians. Money is power. And, having more and more concentrated at your school gives you more power in all sorts of ways. And so they extract, resources in those ways and things that, aren't always immediately obvious, but are clearly happening. And so, because the schools are organized as nonprofits, we think of them as charities. They're not. They're everything but.
Yeah,
Wow.
somewhat related to that, you mentioned endowments and money markets. Do you know what a 529 plan is?
No.
Okay, so it's a tax advantage savings plan. It's designed to encourage saving for future education expenses.
Okay. Got it. Yep.
So 529 plans, estate planning, gifting for education, they're all part of financial planning. And
Yes.
there's nearly $500 billion in the 529 space. And so when you mentioned that, my mind went to wondering what you think the impact is. Like, what role are asset managers and wealth managers playing in this idea that the university admission system is really designed for the wealthy and well connected? And so I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that and what
Yeah.
you would want them to, like, what would you want them to take from your message and do with it?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. What role do asset managers play in this whole story? I think they play a very significant role. So if you look at the board of trustees at virtually any major elite college, it's big law partners, it's private equity tycoons, it's sometimes hedge fund guys, and every once in a while it'll be like a high profile CEO. So it'll be like at U Chicago, it's like Satya Nadella, it's David Rubenstein, and I think couple of people you wouldn't know who are obviously very wealthy, but are basically a part of that sort of like capital class, right? Like they make their bread and butter in capital markets. Um, why do the boards look like that? It's really interesting. A lot of the board members have funds that the university endowments then invest in, and so there's this like really weird, like self-serving logic to it, which is that the bigger the endowments of the universities get, the more money is on the take for the trustees who are supposed to be overlooking the educational mission. So a lot of these trustees have no incentive to break this cartel. This cartel is like what's funding, all their billions. I mean, they could never have such an amazing opportunity to fundraise than a lot of these endowments. And so for all of those reasons, like the capital class the moneyed class, is keeping things, or has at least it has no incentive to criticize the way things are working now.
Yeah. That's what I'm trying to say. I feel like it's kind of all connected. It's kind of this
Hmm.
like swirl and cycle, and the fact that there's $500 billion, nearly $500 billion in the 529 space, it tells me that there's a little bit like there's like a deeper thing going on here.
Well, this is the other thing. You're talking about 529s. I'm not exactly familiar with that specific thing, but I can talk to tuition tax credits in general, and subsidies for this type of thing in general. The higher education lobby spends close to $80 million in Washington a year. It's the second highest spending, I think, second highest spending, definitely one of the top five highest spending lobbies in Washington. They have more power essentially than virtually any other industry. And so, a lot of these things that are happening, like, the student debt relief plan the Biden administration is doing, I think, look, it's obviously a good thing to help people dig out of debt. But if you're not going to fix the structural issues that cause them to get into that debt, in 5 to 10 years, a new generation is going to be saddled with that much debt, if not more, because the lessons the schools are learning from this is, okay, let's just jack up prices even more. Credit's still flowing. People will still borrow and pay, and the federal government will bail them out. So why wouldn't we even charge even more? Like, it's getting more and more untethered from reality. We have to tackle this now. It's not too late. But, if things keep going in this way, it might be. These debt bubbles are no joke. We can't keep wiping out $1 trillion in debt every 10 years. It's going to get worse. I mean, this is very unsustainable and dangerous for the country.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
feel like
One of
there's
my Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was going to ask, tying into that, one of the questions I had for you is that given that less than 2% of students are attending elite colleges,
Mhm.
what's the impact on the average person, and maybe that massive debt bubble and just the distribution of an insane amount of debt across a huge swath of the younger population? Maybe that's the answer.
Yeah, so you're right. Only 2% of students go to elite colleges. But the elite colleges have all this capital and they use it in Washington to facilitate the policies that create the debt at the other 98%, right? At the institutions the other 98% attend. And the other thing the elite schools do is they maintain this hub and spoke conspiracy with the US News and World Report, and lower ranked schools in the hundreds and the 500s, they're still measuring themselves by that barometer. They're still trying to climb that ranking. So even at a lower level, more and more schools are getting exclusive and charging more and more. So, the way this works is you have Penn and UVA. I'm just giving two examples of two schools that might be in competition for the same number of students. One's a public school, one's a private school. Okay, well, to compete with Penn, it's very difficult for UVA with in-state tuition being regulated. So what does UVA do? They take more and more international students. So anytime they do expand enrollment, it's for kids who aren't actually from Virginia. It's out-of-state rich kids. It's rich kids from China, rich kids from India, rich kids from Europe. It's like all the people, but for the taxpayers who have lifted this institution up in that state for years. I mean,
right.
they've turned their back on, the core mission of the institution. And, when UVA does that, well, now Virginia Tech to compete with UVA has to do the exact same thing. And then now JMU to compete with Virginia Tech has to do the exact same thing. It trickles down all the way. And so, a lot of the tuition inflation we're seeing is driven by this dynamic, is driven by when you have so much scarcity at the top, there's that spillage of all these rich kids to the next level and to the next level and to the next. And it's driving up costs because that's how the rankings reward you throughout the system. There's this chain reaction that's really bad. And, again, going back to the second point, they're spending a lot of money in Washington, free credit, make it flow as much as possible, get people hooked on debt, like you said, very early when they're 18, and then, hope for a government bailout. It's like the 2008, housing crisis on steroids. It's worse, in how systemic it's been.
At any point, has a university professor's salary increased while tuition's been increasing? Or are they kind of getting screwed at some point in this whole process?
Yeah, look, I think the professor question is an interesting question because there's basically like two classes of professors. There's tenure track faculty, and then there's adjunct professors. And so, I read a paper once by Austin Goolsbee, who used to be, I think, in President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors, where he basically, I think, like empirically demonstrated that for people who want to get tenure at a university, they are getting squeezed on wages. They're getting squeezed on wages because they can't really leave because they're on this tenure track. And what that means is like they have to keep teaching at that university until the university grants them tenure or the ability to research whatever they want. And for academics, like this is often the holy grail because they want to like think about original things. They want to like be free from like the pressure of having to figure out how you're going to make a wage so that they can like actually think about things that maybe no one else finds interesting, but might have massive spillovers for society. And so a lot of them are on this tenure track and their wages are getting squeezed because the universities know that you're not going to go anywhere else. Same thing for grad students. So grad students who teach, I have a roommate here who's a PhD student, who's an international student. There's all sorts of oppressive conditions for grad students where they get paid very little. Oftentimes for like foreign students, they could only teach at that university. If they take some sort of other job, it runs afoul of visa restrictions. So the schools take advantage of that and they really squeeze these people for very little wages. On the other hand, obviously, the administrators, those salaries are so bloated, there's virtually no accountability. And it's really insane what's happening with spending in those areas. So it's this weird, like, sort of like, twofold story where some people are getting squeezed, other people at the university are, have their mouth in the trough.
Yeah.
Hmm.
A couple of
Yeah.
beats ago, you were talking. Go ahead, Jay.
Oh yes, I was going to say, just listening to you speak the last 45 minutes, one of the things that comes to mind for me is this idea of the Veblen good, the
Mhm.
idea that there are certain goods out there that the more expensive they are, the more attractive they are among the highly wealthy because they're a means of signaling wealth. And maybe we have space for cars or apparel to fit in that Veblen good category. I don't see anything wrong with there being Bentleys and Gucci bags and Louis Vuitton bags, but to turn education, the thing that's meant to be preparing the young generation for the world and for everything that lies in front of them, and to turn that into a Veblen good is just really messed up.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I think that is exactly what's happening. And I think, look, to some respect, like that's sort of always been the position of the elite colleges. If you go back and read like John Kennedy's Harvard application essay, he says he wants to go to Harvard because his father went to Harvard and he thinks it's important to be a quote Harvard man.
Hmm.
And I mean, essentially what he's saying is he wants to signal that he has that elite status, right? In Boston society. And so look, I understand that, to some extent, like that's been baked into these schools for a very long time. But I agree with you when, they're as time has gone on, they should have been opening up more and more. And instead, what we're seeing is they opened up a little bit, and then basically around like late 1970s, early 1980s, they've closed up again, and they've gotten more and more exclusive again. We're retrenching. After World War II, there was this massive boom where all of these elite schools were competing to enroll more and more students. You had this sort of like golden age for competitive education. And since like the late 1970s, early 1980s, basically since the advent of the rankings age, you've seen the exact opposite happen, where this cartel has sort of locked up these seats. It's become more and more of Veblen good, and that's sort of what's the logic of the system. Because the more scarce it is, it's how you get the $10 million donation from the billionaire, right? That's how you get the craziest one for me was Stanford got a $1.1 billion donation from John Doerr, like the venture capitalist. Unbelievable. I mean, if you're gonna donate, look, there's you want to donate, it's your money, donate it how you want. But if you're gonna donate money and you're gonna donate $1 billion, why would you give it to Stanford? Like, they're not suffering from poverty. Like, how is that money being used in an effective way there? And sort of if you think back, to the sort of like Gilded Age, what did all the really rich guys then do? Vanderbilt started a school, Rockefeller started U Chicago. Stanford was started by Leland Stanford, another robber baron, who made his money in the railroads. Carnegie Mellon, Andrew Carnegie, one of the richest men of all time. Andrew Mellon, another very rich guy. I mean, a lot of the story then was like these really rich people would start universities, and these universities would compete with each other. There was new entry all the time. What's happened since is entry is dried up. It's dead. If you want to compete with the elite colleges, you need like more than $10 billion. There's been virtually no elite college startup since like Caltech in like 1904 or something like that. It's in that era.
Wow.
And so there's no competition. I mean, competition is dead today at the college level, and that's why you're seeing all this crazy stuff happen at the top, which then is trickled into this insane system everywhere else.
Yeah, I think one of the underlying themes throughout this conversation seems to be around the opportunity gap. And so we're kind of talking about this at the university level, but I think you can even take it down one notch and talk about affluent high schools and
Yeah,
how
for sure.
they set up the next generation, because, they're going to offer up access to different team sports. They're going to offer up access to things like maybe dance and art and things that maybe a lower income neighborhood may not have access to. And it kind of feeds into this whole system. So maybe it actually starts down even at the high school level.
I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. I think like one of the crazy things is how the schools then incentivize those types of high schools to differentiate themselves in this way. So one example is like, they recruit for things like crew, for things like
Yeah.
squash, for like, no one watches those sports. It's not generating any revenue at the schools. Like, I mean, it's exclusively an elite giveaway. They want people from elite private schools to attend the schools. They've created these carve outs. It doesn't look good if you, explicitly take bribes, so they take donations. It doesn't look good if you explicitly pinpoint certain high schools, so they could do like these sports exemptions. But it's the exact same thing. The logic is the same. And, sort of going back to the price fixing cartel, they used to do it in the open. They abstracted it at one level. It's exactly what's happening in a lot of these other instances too.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's such a niche thing, right? Like,
Yeah,
it's a niche sport that you're going to have access to at this elite university.
it's crazy.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you see, any solutions on the horizon, Sahaj? If someone out there among listeners is interested in getting involved, they're so inclined, how might they be able to be part of resolving this huge problem?
So I think there are a couple of things that give me some hope, but I think there's a lot more like all of us can be doing. So going back to this lawsuit, I think that was really one of the best pieces of public interest lawyering that I've seen in a very long time. I mean, like I said, like unless it took me like 2 years to really look into this space to figure that sort of price fixing conspiracy out. No one would have found it but for those lawyers who really looked into it and figured out how to go after the schools for doing this. If they win in this case, they're going to recover a massive amount of money that's going to go back to those students who were stolen from by that price fixing cartel. So I think that's an example of the type of thing I would encourage more and more lawyers, more and more plaintiff side firms to be looking into. The schools are acting in anti-competitive ways. Can you find what those specific ways are, and can you figure out ways to file civil side lawsuits to try and recover some of that money? The second thing I would say is like on maybe like a more accessible basis. One of the things that I've been doing over the last 2 years is trying to get students to understand how some of this like price fixing works, how some of these other things the elite colleges are doing that are unfair work, and get them to organize protests, to write in their newspapers. And it's been working. I mean, it's been happening at a lot of places. I was recently interviewed by the Johns Hopkins newspaper. I went to Georgetown. I was interviewed by the Georgetown Voice. A lot of the lawyers in this case have been interviewed at a bunch of these papers, and people are paying attention. Like it's showing up on like congressmen and senators' radars. I spoke recently to a lot of Democrats on this issue, and also even one Republican who took this very seriously, and specifically applying like antitrust laws to a lot of these violations. So I think there is some momentum in that regard. I think there could be more. I think students really need to be taking this more seriously, need to be thinking about, how can they protest more? How can they raise more awareness around this issue? Because there are things that will happen if they start to pull those levers. And then lastly, I'd say, the people who are probably most affected by this are parents, right? I mean, it is a massive stress to think about, like, how are we going to save this much money to send our kid to college? And I think, like, this is something that drives a lot of American middle class life, which is, how are we going to send our kids to college? Well, it shouldn't be costing this much. If you think about, like, what's changed in the American economy since, like, 1990, the big area, the big engine of progress has been, the knowledge economy, like Google, YouTube, all of these things that should have been making education much more cheap, right? Like, if you think about everything that's gotten cheaper in our society, probably like access to information has been the thing that's gotten cheapest. And yet, this directly related sector, higher education, has gotten more and more and more expensive. It doesn't make any sense. It's not linked to the fundamentals of what's happening in the economy. This can only be explained by these abuses of market power. And so I would say, like, parents need to vote on this issue. I don't see enough of this yet, unfortunately. I don't see enough of, parents, like, taking these debt issues really serious, affirmatively and early, and, pressuring their congressman to come up with a justification for what they're going to be doing about student debt, for how they're going to be reining in the abuses of the colleges, elite and otherwise. I mean, there just isn't enough pressure on people in Washington to hold this big lobby accountable. And on the other hand, there's a lot of money flowing in the other way. So unless there's a massive public wave, I mean, nothing's going to change. As long as this much money flows in, like, it is very difficult to get anything to change in Washington. So it has to be a really big wave on the other side. And I would really encourage parents to start taking this seriously, organize amongst yourselves, talk about these issues, and figure out how you can engage, maybe even run for office. Like, figure out how you can engage on these issues. This is a massive, massive issue. And I think it's something that a lot of people can be doing a lot more on.
No, it's clear you're passionate about reforming higher education and elite education as opposed to removing it completely. So, and you just talked about, the access to information that we all have at our fingertips. So just, have you thought about what the future of education looks like?
Yeah, look, it's an interesting question. It's one I think about a lot. But I would say probably, like, the view amongst our generation at this point, the consensus view, is that colleges are sort of a thing of the past, or are certainly less important than they used to be. And my slightly contrarian view on this is that the elite colleges are more important than they ever have been. And so, oftentimes when I speak to people our age, there's this big disconnect between what I'm saying and what they implicitly believe. Because I think they see people like the two of you who are, in this or in this creator economy, in these spaces where, all these signaling and credentials don't matter as much, where, the barriers of entry have come down because exactly of the IT revolution that we were talking about earlier, right? The same tools that made information more available also made it possible for you to put out your own information, to create your own content cheaply and affordably. But in virtually every other sector, there has been this barrier of entry that's gotten worse, not better, right? So I think a lot of people have this sort of biased frame because, we're the TikTok generation, we're the YouTube generation. You see Jake and Logan Paul, but if you want to go into aerospace, you still have to get that degree, right? Like, you can't. There are a lot of sectors you can't penetrate in that way, and so that's why the schools are still incredibly important. And I think that's the story that gets lost a little bit.
Yeah, I want my doctor to still go to school.
Yeah.
I'm curious. You brought up age, Sahaj. How old are you? I'm curious.
So I'm 24. I'll be 25 in June.
That's
Nice.
awesome, man. You're a savage, bro. Yeah, you are a beast. I have never seen someone be able to just deliver that amount of expertise on such a singular topic. It's super impressive.
If
I
it
really
wasn't for
appreciate that. Thank you.
if it wasn't
Go
for
ahead.
this topic, what else would you be passionate about?
Look, I'm really interested in, sort of these, like, concentration issues generally. I think, like, obviously higher ed is like, the frame I'm able to best offer this on, but I think this is actually an issue across the economy. So if you think about like most sectors, there's been more and more concentration, more and more monopolization. If you think about like, for example, and not even like big tech, right? Like I think that's the story that gets a little bit of attention. You think about the big banks after 2008, they've gotten even more concentrated. This is a story that no one really talks about. The big banks are even bigger than they were in 2008, and there are fewer of them. If you think about like aerospace, Boeing still produces planes, and somehow their planes don't work anymore. So like even though like their quality is degrading, it's still basically the only game in town. There's been virtually no entry in that market. If you think about the farm economy, you have Monsanto doing seeds. You have, 3 meat packers, sometimes 4 meat packers. You have like a handful of retailers, Albertsons and Kroger emerging. Even in video games, you're seeing like this Microsoft Activision deal. I mean, the economy is basically, I think the story of like the last 40 years in the economy has been one of market power, one of concentration. And I think it's like, it's something we don't really think about because, we're always told, those econ 101 models, supply and demand, entries, all in perfect competition, entry is always possible. You have therefore perfect entry. Even if 2 people merge, a third guy will come in and compete in that market. I think in a lot of markets, we're seeing the exact opposite. People merge and entry never ends up happening. So if you think about aerospace, before SpaceX, I mean, we couldn't even put our own rockets in space. And the only reason SpaceX happened is because Elon Musk is kind of crazy and like gambled the farm on his companies. No one else, I mean, very few people would have done that. Like that was not a rational thing to do. It was something that worked out for him, and thankfully, because this country now has the ability to put people in space again. But for him, I mean, conceivably, there would have been another 30, 40 years of stagnation in space. And so in all of these other sectors, apart from IT, there's been more and more concentration and less innovation. We're going slower in terms of air travel ever since the Concorde retired. We're, again, in cars, but for Tesla, I think, there'd been stagnation for a very long time. Some people in the 60s envisioned flying cars and all these crazy things, never came to happen. And so, I think like that is the story of the economy in all these ways, all these frames that you can put on it. It's one I don't think gets told often enough. So if I wasn't focused on higher ed, I'd probably focus on one of those other stories.
And if you could be any animal, what would you be?
That's an interesting question. Probably an otter or a beaver. I think, are beavers the one that create dams?
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah. The beavers are really underrated. They're very smart.
There you go.
Nice. That's a first.
No, I think this is a great conversation because you've obviously helped us understand more about the corruption that's taking place at the college level. We even talked about at the high school level, but what ends up happening, I think, at the end of this kind of conversation is, first of all, it's going to linger on forever. It's going to be on the internet. And so hopefully what it does is it kind of sets up a brighter and more accessible and better future for education moving forward.
Yeah, look, I think there's a lot that can change. One of the things that I've been trying to do more of is speak more and more to people who are interested in running for office, people who are in office, try to get like people to understand the language of monopoly, and specifically when it comes to this issue. I really think that if we are not now, we soon will be at a tipping point where, if the ideal economy is one of infinity, of abundance, of many entrants, of many startups, of many new people, of infinite opportunity, we're actually moving in the opposite direction where the number isn't infinity, but the number is one. There's one company, there's one winner, and everyone else is sort of stuck in the mud. And I think, the sooner we figure out how to reverse that, the better shape this country will be.
I love it. Well, definitely appreciate your time, and thank you for stopping by.
Listen, this conversation was awesome. I'd love to come back at some point. You guys are clearly like very good at what you're doing.
Let's run it back in a few years and see how many more scandals have taken place, or if we've seen a drop in the number of scandals, a drop in tuition, et cetera, et cetera. Let's see how this all plays out. It's going to be interesting because it's going to impact us. I mean, a lot of my friends now, including me, have like little children. And so this is something that we are going to be thinking about, is college, higher education, where we're going to put our money. And ultimately in 18 years, is it even going to be something that's necessary? So top of mind for people in my world.
Look,
Definitely.
and let me offer this hope. I've often offered the view that I think schools are going to continue to be important. I hope they're not. I hope somehow through some way, whether it's AI or something else, we can move more towards that Lincoln model where it's more about like what you actually know as opposed to where you learned it. But until that happens, I would love to see more reform in this system because I mean something's got to give. Like this is very unsustainable.
Totally.
Keep fighting the fight.
Yeah.
All right, appreciate that, brothers.
We'll be talking again.
I'm
All right.